So the types of guidance used by a coach in order to aid performance, one of the 12 mark topics. So for question 7 on the exam, and obviously this will be half of the 12 marker. So we're looking for around about, can you get 8 points or so on the answer in order to access the highest band of marks. So there are 4 types of guidance which we need to know about, sometimes classed as 3 because sometimes manual and mechanical go together. So the first type is visual. So visual guidance will be some sort of visual aid. So quite often in sport this would be a demonstration. A good coach would give an effective demonstration, and obviously that links into our observational learning theory, etc. But other forms of visual guidance could be in the shape of a poster, the use of a whiteboard, etc., or a tactics board for pointing out things visually. So the whole idea of visual guidance is to give the participants, the players, a mental picture of how it looks, and so they're able to see in action the technique that we're doing. Secondly, we've got verbal guidance. So this is obviously where the coach explains it verbally, so they give some sort of instructions. So normally this would be to do with some kind of feedback or teaching points in order to either improve the skill or some instruction as to actually how to do the skill. And then manual. So manual is about being physically supported. So this is the coach using their own hands normally in order to physically support or physically move the participant into the right position. And then we have mechanical. So mechanical guidance is using equipment. So some sort of equipment in a similar manner maybe to manual, and this is why the two are often grouped together. And the advantages of the two are very, very similar as well, as we'll see in a minute. But this is where we would actually use not our own hands but some sort of equipment. So examples of this could be like a swimming float, could be like a rugby scrum, things like that, a harness to support people in gymnastics, etc. So visual guidance first. Clearly the demonstration has to be accurate. That's one of the key points. So it needs to be correct in terms of what we're doing, and then the model is also important. So again, if we link that into our social learning theory, our observational learning theory, then if we can get a model who is similar to the participants or a good role model who is respected, then that's going to be a better demonstration, and the participants are more likely to think that they are able to actually copy. So advantages of using visual guidance: this is good for the cognitive learner and also that associative learner who's just developed from the cognitive stage. So the visual aid here will really help those beginners in their search for trying to find out how to do the skill. So particularly in that cognitive stage, in the very early stages of trying to teach a skill, a demonstration to create that mental picture for the person who doesn't really know what it looks like is really useful. So this obviously provides a clear idea of the movement. All right, it gives the learner a picture of how to do it and a recipe almost as to how to do the skill. Alongside the visual, and this sometimes we would use verbal as well, and quite often that will be the case, but even within just visual we can highlight cues. So we can highlight, as we would do if we related this to observational learning theory and our 4 stages of that. So in that attention stage, in the first stage of attention, we'd like to highlight cues that the performer should be looking at in the actual demonstration. Some disadvantages. So within that demonstration, it could lead to demotivation if the performer is unable to replicate the skill. So this sometimes through just visual guidance, then performers can't get their head around it particularly quickly, and this would be where that retention stage of observational learner theory would come in, so that you would repeat it to allow them to more chance to get that into their heads. Sometimes there's too much information within a visual demonstration, so again this might be that we need to just demonstrate a certain part or highlight those cues to the most important elements. Obviously, if the demonstration is inaccurate, and that can often be the case, that's not ideal for people trying to replicate what was going on. So it's really important that any demonstration is done correctly. Static demonstrations can lose impact, so really we need to try to make it as meaningful as possible and put it into its real environmental context, as in where it would fit in the game, etc. And there's less detail within the visual, so we wouldn't be able to go into the detail, for example, that we would within verbal guidance. So that brings us on to verbal guidance, the second type. So 3 C's here. We've got clear, concise and correct. So this linking into the a little bit of feedback here. The verbal guidance must be clear in terms of what we're saying. It should be concise so that we don't end up with information overload, which we would think about with our short-term sensory store and short-term memory. And it obviously needs to be correct information, so the coach giving some information to a performer needs to know what they're talking about, needs to actually give correct details as to what's going on. So it already mentioned that verbal guidance can be combined with visual guidance, so this is probably preferential, and particularly within those early stages of learning, if we can give some sort of demonstration and also some key pointers, as we mentioned before, highlighting the cues, picking out the things that to watch for in the demonstration, but also giving some key 2 or 3 main coaching points that the performer should be looking out for. And verbal guidance should be given immediately, so it has most impact when we can actually give that fairly quick. So advantages of verbal guidance. Good for that autonomous learner who knows what they're doing, who maybe needs to correct minor elements of some little faults that might be going on. So we can go into much more detail with the verbal analysis. However, it's good for all stages of learning if we combine it. So particularly with that visual guidance that we've mentioned, obviously even the cognitive learner also needs that instruction. So really verbal guidance can transform across all stages of learning. It can be very quick, can be given immediately with verbal guidance. So this is good for allowing us quick time, so if we don't have much time, or that we have large groups where we can get around people and give some quick tips. And as already mentioned, really, that we can focus cues in a demonstration. Disadvantages. Often coaches are guilty of this, is to giving far too much information, and so for talking for too long. So we should keep it very concise and to the point, and one stage at a time, and then allowing some practice. So overload of information would not be beneficial for the performer. Those cognitive learners may find it difficult to understand if the instructions are quite complicated, or maybe they're not put across very well by the coach. Some people might not understand what is meant or take it the wrong way or whatever. And some movements are just difficult to explain, so it's quite hard to say what it is that you actually want them to do. So quite often it would be just easier just to show them visually. And if you're trying to go into that detail, it's quite hard to get your point across exactly what you mean. Large groups, it's difficult. So in terms of being able to get round and talk to everybody, and give that verbal guidance to everyone within that large group, can be boring, someone just talking rather than making the session a bit more dynamic, so the coach can go on and players can be demotivated by that. And it could be that if there's too much feedback given by the coach, that the players eventually could become over-reliant on that feedback. So for the purposes of advantages and disadvantages, we'll lump manual and mechanical together. So manual and mechanical can be good for the novices, can be good for that cognitive learner, in terms of allowing them to do some movements that maybe they couldn't do. So we've got the climbing coach over here who's using some manual guidance, alright, allowing that climber to maybe get into a position there that they wouldn't be able to actually do for themselves. So in this case, it can reduce fear. It can build that person's confidence. You can allow them to do something, alright, and gradually take steps and offering less support in terms of the manual or mechanical guidance, and allow them to build it up themselves. And for something like that climber, if it is dangerous, then it reduces the risk. So again, in things like gymnastics, if we're doing somersaults over the vault, it could be that using the harness or using our hands can make things a little bit safer. And for the learner themselves, like getting into that position, often it gives that kinesthetic feel of how the movement should feel, and how getting into that certain position that maybe again that they wouldn't be able to do, they get the feel of how that movement feels and doing that whole skill there. So the disadvantages of using mechanical and manual is that the performer can become too reliant on that help. So if we give it too much, or that we don't maybe take it away quick enough, then the performer might not be able to transfer it into being able to do it themselves. And although we've said that they do get the feel of the movement by doing it, it could be that they're not getting the whole feel. So obviously, by being helped by the coach or the equipment, it's not the natural feel, so they don't get the full kinesthetic awareness of how to do the skill. And when it comes to it, because they've got that assistance there, maybe they can't correct it themselves. Can be difficult for a large group because the coach, particularly if it was manual guidance, the coach can only take one person at a time. The equipment also, depending on what equipment we've got, may also be able to just work with one person at a time. So it would take a long time for everybody to get their turn. And in complex or ballistic movements, if it's really difficult, it could be quite difficult to use. So there are 3/4 types of guidance that you should be able to talk about in terms of what they are, giving explanations and examples of each type of guidance, as well as explaining the advantages and disadvantages for your 12-mark question.